Okay, cool. Well, yes, so Frank N, we're lucky he's here today because there's a lot going on in his world right now, and he is going to give us a really, really good, thorough look at the literacy principles, which is something over the past couple of weeks we've talked about a lot on these calls, but um, those discussions have mostly been our interpretations of the principles, and now we're getting it from the source. So this is kind of like our peak of the climate literacy principles. So yeah, is there, before we launch into that, is there anything that people want to share, like quick news items or help needed in any way or anything like that before we launch? Oh, yep, Cass, go ahead.
Hey, yeah, I'm not on the emails that like start these, and I was just
Uh,
hoping I could get on those.
have you, well, I can chat you. I'll chat you. How about
Cool,
that?
cool.
Yeah.
Thank
I
you.
got
I'm on the clean list, and I'm just hanging out, but like I don't get the emails.
I
Good.
got a
Strange.
question for, oh, I got a question for Cassandra. What about how things are preparing in Tampa for the storm there? How are you guys doing?
Hopefully
Um,
evacuation.
yeah, so I live inland. I live at 50 feet above elevation. Unfortunately, I have pets, so I could not evacuate out of the Tampa Bay area. But fortunately, I'm staying with my neighbor who has a new build with hurricane straps and hurricane windows, and we're hunkering down there. I couldn't find a place that would accept my animals, but we are not expected to flood. We never do. Again, I live in something called Seminole Heights, meaning height. um, so we're just crossing our fingers, but it's pretty anxiety inducing, as you may believe. And I know there's other folks from Florida on this call too who will be experiencing Hurricane Milton. But we, yeah, we're just. I will say uh, we deal with it with humor. So I will be I'll be laughing a lot in this call, and
Hmm.
um,
Yes. Good, good to check in about that. And I'm sure it's really, really stressful. So I'm I appreciate you being here despite all of that. But yeah, very stressful. Um, Sarah, I saw you had your hand up too.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure everybody also knows, maybe Frank is going to talk about it, but not only do we have climate literacy guidelines, we also have the NAAE's guidelines for excellence, or sorry, not only do we have climate literacy, we now have guidelines for excellence as well from
Have
the
they come out?
yes.
They
So
actually released?
they're out. I'm going to put it in the chat box. So this is a complimentary document to go with
Yeah.
what Frank
Yep.
is going to share
Yep.
about. So make sure you know
They
about
were
that.
braided. Just, I mean,
Mhm.
we'll get into it, but it was a braided process. I mean, we're still stunned that the federal climate literacy process came out before the NAAE process. I mean, we were like, what?
Well,
We thought we were going to be,
Bora told me they
we,
were going to come out on the same day, but then they didn't. They came out like a week later. So
yeah,
anyway,
yeah, yeah.
check out
Okay.
this really great document if you're not familiar with the guidelines for excellence. Everybody, it's a really good tool for
I'll
framing.
weave it into my remarks, Sarah. That's awesome. I appreciate that.
Dawn, I think your hand was up next.
Yeah, I just wanted to announce formally that the PRI has launched the Center for Climate Change Education at PRI, which isn't really a big change in what we're doing, just making it more obvious that we are actually doing it. So you can read the press release there, and we're excited about it. So that was officially announced at GSA a week and a half ago, I guess, or 2 weeks ago.
That's very exciting. Congratulations. That's huge.
Thanks. Yeah.
That's amazing.
And I'm not quite done with my lunch, so I'm gonna turn my camera back off.
Fair. All right, Frank G.
Okay, I just put it just copied it in the chat again, but this last weekend was the Solar Oregon Energy Trust of Oregon um, Go Zero home tour, Go Zero Net home tour, and I'm including that because our house was one of them, the ones that were in there. So it was a very fun experience.
Nice. Thanks for sharing that link.
I might jump in, Gina.
Yeah.
And
Love
just
it.
give a prod for our webinar on Thursday. It is a webinar on cultivating hope and resilience in the face of climate change with Maria Oyala, who's just an amazing researcher who's done great work on youth and mental health and climate change, and has a lot of cool papers out if you want to dig into that. So she'll be speaking on some of her recent work Wednesday at 12 o'clock Mountain Time. I put the link in the chat there, so please check it out, register, and spread the word.
Yes. Go ahead,
Gina,
Frank.
I have an announcement, but it's related, but not the same as what we're going to talk about today. So in the chat, I just added a link to a feedback form, which has access to a document, which is called the Transformational Skills Guide, expanding the definition of climate literacy, I think is where the working document we have. Why that's important is we'll see in the process of what the U.S. Global Change Research Program could do in defining climate literacy. But what it couldn't do was a skills architecture. So we knew in the listening session process, what do you know and what you're able to do are two important pieces, but the enterprise that generated the climate literacy guide that you saw released on the September 24th was really more about knowledge. It alludes to skills, but it doesn't have a robust skills architecture. We had to come up with a completely different approach to come up with a skills architecture, which we did on top of everything else. So the reason why you haven't seen me for a long time is because of all this. This is in draft. It's a consultation draft. There's a lot of international partners, some people you'll recognize, some people you won't. But I just give it to you as something that I would love for the CLEAN network to push on, to test, to see if this architecture is valuable, that complements the guide we're about to talk about when I do my presentation. But this is a whole new effort. It complements the NAAE work, it complements the USGCRP work, it complements, but it's different. So push on it, feedback on it. But I couldn't think of a group of people that I would love to have really tested. If it's valuable, we need to know it. If it's not valuable, then we also need to know how to make it valuable. Surprise. We just released this last weekend at Harvard.
That's exciting.
It's kind of like that.
Well, with that, Frank, do you want to launch in?
Sure. Let me get back to where we were. Too many websites, too many screens. Here we go. Share. And then slideshow. So you guys seeing my slides?
We're seeing your Zoom launch screen still. Might have to
Stop share. It's funny. Okay, let's try that again. Oh, I see what happened. Sorry, too much going on all at the same time. This is what happens when you're, yeah, I'm almost there.
I think that
Okay.
the number of tabs and windows you have open is parallel to the amount of noise that's happening in your brain at any given time. I have a lot of
Don't tell
tabs
me
open
that.
right now.
Don't tell me that. That's the scariest analogy or a way of looking at my brain. So now you're seeing these slides? Awesome.
Yes, looks
So this is, for those who don't know, there's a webinar tomorrow. So you notice the date is off. is that the U.S. Global Change Research Program has a webinar tomorrow that is going to be I'm going to be going over some of the same stuff, but I'll be emphasizing different things for who I'm talking to now. So for those who don't know, the Climate Literacy Guide goes back a long way. 2008 was the first version. 2009 was the second version. It was always approved by the U.S. Global Change Research Program. This is their mission. And now it has 15 agencies and departments. Why this is important in the context of this behemoth task that I really didn't want to do. Every time I've actually been pushed into updating the Climate Literacy Guide because it's so bleeping hard to do this. The reason it's hard is because to get this group of agencies to agree to the same identical language on climate is wicked hard. Like, it's a wicked hard problem. So we did it. It was 21 months, we got there, but this is the body. But the reason why this is so important, and I think this is important in the context, I'm not just speaking to you all because of the recording. The reason why this is so important for the US government and these agencies to generate this document is because it gives educators of every form, communicators of every form, decision makers of all the variety that are important to the work we do collectively, a really trusted, solid, relatable, accessible, but also trustworthy document on this topic, climate literacy. So, for those who don't know, this comes from ocean literacy. Ocean literacy was developed as an idea that said, we're not learning enough about the oceans before 2005. And so NOAA and a group of other organizations came up with this idea, ocean literacy, and they created the first guide. It's been updated many times, much faster than climate literacy because of our process. And then so I came into NOAA to do climate literacy for NOAA. That was my original reason for coming to NOAA in 2005. And because they knew that climate also was similarly not taught enough, not enough museums. It just wasn't it's a really important topic, but it's not being focused on. So we came with this external structure, the Climate Literacy Guide. You see there the 2008 version. I mean, not everybody knows that there was a first version, which we rapidly transformed into the second version, 2009. Subsequent to that, and that was all through the U.S. Global Change Research Program. Then another effort, the Energy Literacy Guide came out in 2012, has been updated and tweaked. That was really led by Department of Energy. NOAA really led the climate literacy process with other agencies. So this is the backstory of what's been going on here. But the 2009 guide, it was an original framework. I mean, Don, if I remember right, you were on the writing team of the NRC framework. Do I remember that right? So at the time, the National Science Education Standards really didn't have very much climate in them at all. It was one of the motivations for developing the Climate Literacy Guide. It wasn't the only, but it was one of them. And subsequent to that, the whole NRC framework process for K-12 science education, and then led to the Next Generation Science Standards, which now 48 states have a much stronger, more robust set of standards in science related to climate that is directly related to this and to Don Haas, who's on the call right now. So the full circleness is quite lovely, because when we released this in 2008, a group of us came together and said, there's no way you can actually make climate literacy without a network. So we started in 2008 saying, we'll create a climate literacy network. That's what CLEAN used to be called, the Climate Literacy Network. And we came together and we met and figured out how each of us would do pieces of the puzzle. Part of my contribution to this was creating the guide, which that's what I've been doing. That's one of the many things I do. But, that interagency process and expert review has been used by academics and teachers and museums and zoos and aquariums and park systems and communication systems forever. But it clearly became both domestically and internationally. So that was the backstory, right? But we knew eventually we had the ability to take on this task again. We got authorized in January of 23 to go forth with this process. It took us until September of 24 to finish this thing. That's how long this bleeping process took. It took years of my life away. to get this thing done. It's that hard. So I've donated some years of life to get this done. I'm not kidding. It's hard. So, but it's important. And so if you're going to put hard, do it on important things. So that was the motivation. Science has changed. The field has changed. There's high demand. We're getting pounded away on the government side. Like, when are you going to update this? 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 So we did. We created a interagency group. That's what's in the development process. That took us about 1.5 years to actually build all the relationships to be able to do this kind of writing. We did the public engagement, the listening sessions. You'll see some of that in here. The interagency expert review came through this. It's structured for educators, communicators, and decision makers. And the sources, because the NCA 5 came out in November of 23, it gave us a solid scientific basis, plus an intention to be much more international in focus, intentionally from the beginning. Other countries have used the climate literacy guide because no one else has done this. Now we built the climate literacy guide to work for other countries much more explicitly than before was the case. That's a really important change. So that was our intention. My co-chair, Carol O'Donnell from Smithsonian, was really, she honored that priority because Smithsonian does a lot of international climate work. So they were like, we got to make this work internationally. It's got to work with all these other dimensions. So, and anytime you want to stop and dig into something more, just raise your hand, speak. We're not a small group, but I mean, realize I'm speaking more for people who are not going to listen to this in recording as well. So just give you some sense. Turned out, we created an incredibly diverse set of agencies because climate is now moving across the entire federal government. So you're going to see some agency logos here that you're like, what? They're involved? Yes. The expertise between HUD, transportation, usual suspects like NASA, EPA, USGS, but then you have other places where Millennium Challenge Corporation, where AmeriCorps and Climate Corps are sitting, Homeland Security, which goes with FEMA, things like that. So USAID, there was a much more diverse set of perspectives involved in this process than was in the past. That's really important. That's also part of why it took so long, because we had a lot of perspectives to consider. One crucial difference between 2009 and 2024 is this pivot from climate science literacy, which is really what the 2009 guide was, to climate literacy. I don't know if you appreciate how important that pivot is, but for the U.S. Global Change Research Program to go with a climate literacy approach as opposed to a climate science literacy approach, that was also part of the hard work. It happened, and we are now squarely climate literacy. So we've removed that word in between the two. That's an important difference because we know that this topic is moving across curriculums in ways that we've never seen before. So we work on honoring what we're seeing in the field, but on also honoring what the work is going on in reality and across our federal family. So now this includes local knowledge and indigenous knowledges. I want to emphasize that S at the end, knowledges. We're really seeing, this came through the National Climate Assessment process, that indigenous knowledge is not a singular thing, it's a multitude. Every nation has different knowledge. And so that was in that S, like this is the kind of rigor and process and thoughtfulness we used in this process, where we're really considering all of it, every word, every part of every word really is intentional. Now social and cultural context is much more emphasized. Social sciences have improved since 2009 in the federal family. So now we have people who have expertise in the social sciences involved in the writing team in a much deeper, richer way than we had in the past. A much stronger solution orientation, and then also justice is now solidly in the architecture, as opposed to before. We didn't talk about justice in 2009. We do now. Now we've done the work, and now we're calling for more of this work. So just to give you some sense of it, I think on this slide where we talk about the definition, a couple key things to note. Take the third bullet, communicate about climate. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. I just lost my screen. I hit the wrong button. There it is. Why? Come on. Interesting. I have to go back over to here. There we go. There we go. Notice that the communicating about in accurate and effective ways. In 2009 we said meaningful and I think accurate, but just those parts of the definition, right? Recognize credible information about climate change and know where to find it. Those two bullets, the middle two, are really different than how we had in 2009, because we see the challenges of how do people, if they are climate literate, they can recognize credible information. They know where to find credible information. I mean, all the issues we're facing with the disaster issues in North Carolina based on Helene, that's, if you're climate literate, you would have a much more successful time navigating that disaster than if you didn't. And then, so I think that helps change this in, I think, important ways. Now, this is the 8 principles. Notice the guiding principle went away. And now we have these principles. I'm going to draw your attention to 8, hope and urgency. If you read that, a livable, sustainable future for all is possible with rapid, just, and transformational climate action. Think about that for a second. For that group of agencies and approved by the U.S. Global Change Research Program to make that statement as something that is important for everyone to understand, that's a really big change. That did not happen in 2009. It did in 2024. Essential Principle 5, climate justice is possible if climate actions are equitable. Again, a really big change. So I just want to give you a sense of access to those 2 really important differences. And, how we know, we kind of collapse down Essential Principle 1, 2, 3, and 4, and a little bit of 5 into 1 and 2. That's a big change. So any questions so far? Because I'm going to switch into kind of the undergirding and the climate assessment for a little bit. Any perspectives? Before I go too much further?
Right, this is,
Yeah,
oh,
Scott's
sorry.
got his hand up. No, go ahead, Scott.
Oh, sorry. I was just curious, why do you think the change happened?
Oh, well, so the first bit of the change was actually as we get into the National Climate Assessment, because the National Climate Assessment, the 5th National Climate Assessment, really moved equity, justice, solutions much more centrally in their process. It allowed us to use that to transform that understanding, those findings, into an updated climate literacy guide. There's a relationship between the National Climate Assessment and the Climate Literacy Guide. For you, not everyone knows this, but the 2nd Climate Literacy Guide was built off of the 2nd National Climate Assessment. So, there's a direct relationship between. So the transformations in the 5th National Climate Assessment gave us the ability to be precise, Scott. The 5th principle is a subtitle of the chapter 20 in the social systems chapter of the 5th National Climate Assessment. That exact language, climate justice is possible if climate actions are equitable. The U.S. Global Change Research Program had already approved that subtitle. So, if you've already approved it, why aren't you approving it in this context? Does that give you so there's a relationship between those 2 things? And then, it was just a slow and deliberate process to really help the multitude of perspectives across the federal family to understand, we have, different perspectives on this. And eventually we got to strong language that we could all agree to. It was a respectful process. It was a persistent process. It was a hard process, but you just work the process and eventually you get there. I don't know if that's a fair answer, but that's kind of how it happened.
And to build on that, Frank, does you think all of this work will lead to the 6th National Climate Assessment actually having an education chapter or a communications chapter?
Sure. So I've been Kelly Lee out of University of California, Irvine, and I have been talking with others about this exact process. The challenge, I think, whether it's a response chapter, it's a chapter, or education is more properly characterized across the entire National Climate Assessment, or, and maybe this is something the CLEAN Network or you would be more interested in, is something called a special assessment, which is it's not part of the National Climate Assessment, but it's a standalone assessment off to the side. There's many ways that we could do a better job of characterizing the importance of this work. And that was you, Sarah, right? Because I can't see people's faces right now.
Yeah, that was me. And that's really interesting. So yeah.
I mean, how we actually work it through. I mean,
I think
there,
having it woven through makes a lot more sense than a chapter.
And also, I think, because if you pull education forward at the same level as mitigation and adaptation, there's a lot of people going, that doesn't make any sense. But if you coupled workforce development, training, education, and communication together as a set of
Sounds like
capabilities,
climate empowerment. That sounds like climate.
yeah, something
empowerment
like
work.
that. Yeah, that would start making more sense in the people who make these decisions. But I think it's an ongoing conversation. It's
Great.
an ongoing conversation.
Thank you for your leadership and
Sure.
keeping it going.
That's why I'm busy, but it's okay. I mean, it's the work. Are there any questions besides those two?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say I would worry about it being folded in if it didn't have clear demarcation that we're paying attention to education, which I think it could easily get lost. But if every chapter had a section on education, that'd be cool.
And Don, to be clear, I've been brought into so many of these conversations for actually many years, many rounds. This actually started in NCA 3, this conversation. But I actually think that we would be better served under a special assessment, a standalone assessment for us and our community, than having to fight that fight to get education properly characterized in the National Climate Assessment process. Is a fight that I'm not sure we'd ever win in ways that we would be satisfied. However, if we characterized like the state of climate education for the nation over every 4 years, I think we would be much more happy with that product than a subpar result that is a compromise that we actually wouldn't be happy with. So, I mean, but I think these are active conversations we have to have as a community to figure out what's the best way forward.
Right. And that would be good as long as the NCA 5 had a very clear shout out to the accompanying document.
Sure. That's yes. And I think, Don, the other piece is, one thing we can do is do a better job of characterizing our literature and our technical inputs to the 6th National Climate Assessment in the input phase than we have historically done. But we can that's a technical move. And I think the more literature we generate about this work that we use in our proposals, our work, that those authors have no idea what we're talking about because they don't look in those sources. There's a lot of great literature that they're not considering, but it's our job to help them consider those pools of excellent work. That's an easy move for us to do, relatively.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. This is Kath Miller. I work with Our Climate Our Future as the education program coordinator that's under Action for the Climate Emergency. I know you can't see, so I'm describing. I wanted to thank you for bringing this to the table. And on the note, I'm on receive mode. I look forward to gathering this information and bringing it back to our work. But we're constantly doing work on climate justice and educating people, because as I'm saying here from Tampa, It's
Yeah.
important now more than ever to discuss these social implications. So however is best for partners to pivot or to utilize this, I appreciate that information. So.
You know, as you're saying that, I think as we're talking about the U.S. Global Change Research Program update to the Climate Literacy Guide, principally as built off of the Fifth National Climate Assessment. Sorry, so many words, but it's the case. But I think that part of what we heard in the listening session, we'll get into that in a second, was the skills. And what I heard you say was really like people need to be able, meaning ability to do things, not just know, but able to. And I think that transformational skills guide that I put at the beginning of when I was announcing, I think is a really important tool for your organization, your work, your perspective to test. Is that usable for the community, or are there things that need to be done to improve it? And you know, just I think that's a complementary thing to this. Does that help?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, no, I
Sure.
appreciate it.
So I don't want to spend a lot of time. I'm going to talk about this more tomorrow, actually, the head of the National Climate Assessment. But I think these new social sciences in the National Climate Assessment, Scott, that gets us back to that question, how did we get this done the way we did? It was because of the National Climate Assessment having these emphasis inside that process allowed us to be able to go in those domains with credibility. You know, like equity and justice is a topic, to see environmental justice in all the forms of that and how that's playing out in society with literature that supports it is a really important thing that would not be possible to do what we did in Essential Principle 5 or Essential Principle 8 without that undergirding work in the National Climate Assessment. So, you know, the response sections, which currently are limited to adaptation mitigation. I know we as a community see those are not the only responses that are important, but getting, as we were just talking about with like NCA 6 and getting education properly characterized means they don't really get that education is a critical part of how society responds to climate change. Well, that's on us to help them get there. We get it, they don't get it yet, but you know, that's a different matter that's in here. So this line here is learning about climate change is important to knowing, communicating, and responding. And so notice that the responding is actually how we get the action orientation to climate change. And I gave this to you. This came from who should use the guide in the listening sessions. I just want you to take a second and think about, these are basically what people in those listening sessions said who should be using the climate literacy guide. Just take a second and look at this. Name something that is like, what? That's surprising. Or I can't believe that showed up. Or why did it take so long for that to show up? But notice, like, it is the types of result, who would be using it is really expanded from where we were in 2009. Don, when you and I were back at the beginning of this in 2009, would you have seen this kind of architecture of who would have been using the climate literacy guide? Would you have ever expected this?
I might have fantasized about it.
Right. I mean, you know, because it's it's so much bolder and bigger and broader than what we would have thought about. I mean, clearly educators and teachers and policymakers and informal educators and students, like those, and then everyone, well, that's very vague. But then you start getting into these sub ones that are really interesting. So I mean, I think what's before us as a community is now we're talking about building climate literacy for all. Well, how do we do that? And so, you know, Gina and I were talking before this call about, like, I think soon we as a community need to start actually naming some of the strategies and the methodologies and the barriers and the solutions that actually help us get to this vision that was named in 2023. One of the things we heard in the listening sessions resoundingly, which kind of, Scott, to how did we get this done, was we honored the listening sessions. We couldn't get to rounds of review and with a public because it just was too hard. But the directions we took from the listening sessions, clearly we heard solutions was wicked important. Resounding signal from that. So we use that to drive hard to get the architecture the way it is. So like these, but you see justice is showing up. It's the same level as science, but also hope and psychology and ethics are showing up equally as with science. It's not that there's no science, it's just not only science. So this is a really important driver for us. You know, what resulted was a huge wave of work. These are just some examples that came from 2009 guide, and you know, but there's a lot more that I'm just so curious as to what's going to happen now. Um, if you're not aware, Smithsonian has got these wonderful guides that I've just come to understand. And Carol O'Donnell, who's my co-chair, they already did some analysis. And look at this. All these guides, whether it's oceans and energy and sustainable communities, environmental justice, climate resilience, climate action, and they're lining them up against these new, because they were part of the writing process, these new principles. And you're seeing an ecosystem of work that's already sort of heading in that direction. So I just give this as an example of how people are already starting to use the guides. If you don't know about these documents, there's a link to it there, but these, you know, they're based on sustainable development goals, but they're really interesting, rich documents. And so in the climate action one, they have these principles that they're already really starting to move in there. I imagine most people on this call have no idea what I'm talking about right now. Has anybody on this call seen these Smithsonian science?
Yes, the ocean one is
Ooh,
incredible, and I've actually been on the
beautiful.
phone with the people who made them, and we're working on. Yeah, they're amazing. It's amazing. It's like, but I'm helping them with some maybe assessment or evaluation tools
Yeah,
to complement them because they're
yeah,
like student learning. Yeah, they're great. They're student
right.
centered and they're really culturally responsive, and I'm really excited about them. Like really
So the
excited.
climate resilience, climate action, sustainable energy. I mean, there's just like
They're
there's
and
more of them, right?
biodiversity just came out, or
Yeah,
ecosystems, like
yeah.
terrestrial ecosystems.
Ecosystems is right up there.
Mhm.
Ecosystem resilience.
Yeah, they're excellent.
So yeah. So like surprise. But you know, I think the just as I'm wrapping up my time here, and just giving you I was just in Boston meeting with different partners. And I went over to the Museum of Science, David Sittenfeld, one of the people of our community, doing really brilliant work there. And there's this exhibit that I took a photograph of. It's an interactive exhibit of like what systems changes would look like in a city like Boston. And you can interact with them based on the work of Boston for people of Boston, but really trying to support the system changes that are happening in that city and for that community through education. That's not incremental stuff. That's just, and it's brilliant work. If you get a chance to look at what the Museum of Science is doing, really highly value it. But I use it as an example of pockets of excellence that we need to connect across the country and beyond. So, um, you know, and the one other thing I'll note is that the Art X climate work that was done in the fifth National Climate Assessment, we wove into the guide in really intentional ways. So the student's work that you see behind there is an illustration. I think she's eighth grade, if I remember right, Ratika. But you know, this it just adds a value. And then one other thing I haven't said yet is that we really tried to, in choosing images and illustrations and graphics, choose things that show the doing of building climate literacy, not like grandfather walking in the woods with his grandchildren holding hands, which is about future and intergenerational work, but it has nothing to do with building climate literacy. It was more illustrative. Now we can actually show the work our community's been doing, plus these important work that came in through the ArtX work, just to show that this is much more a doable thing as opposed to a future thing. Um, if you're not aware, CLEAN is already, and Patrick, you're online, right? You still here?
Yes, I am.
So this page was created very quickly out of the CLEAN page to really start showing in the guidance pages of the CLEAN of how to use this within the context of the CLEAN collection, the CLEAN portal, which is a really new architecture of principles. Patrick, anything else you want to say about that?
Hmm. You know what was really exciting to me about designing these pages is how much we had to support them already. In our mental health pages, there was a real focus on climate justice as one of the categories. And what we did for the teaching across the curriculum pages and NCA 5, it felt like this was the culmination of a lot of what we had been up to. So it's fun to pull it all together. Please check out the resources for these. More coming on these pages soon, but this is a start.
Yeah. And so NOAA has funded CLEAN to really start building out the deeper architecture of how do we teach these new principles with all the heavy work that we've been doing as a community. So, you know, and then Patrick, to this page, you know, we updated the 5th National Climate Assessment teaching pages. It went live in June. Is that right, Patrick?
I think we got it up in May.
Okay. So you may not know about these, but again, the relationship between the updated climate literacy guide and the National Climate Assessment, the 5th one, is really important. So the relationship to trying to do that, well, okay, that's great. It's a guide, it's a tool, but let's actually get into the work that it takes to actually build that literacy. So those pages are now up to date. In the webinar, you already talked about the one that's coming up on Thursday, right, Patrick? Before and earlier in the call.
With Maria Ayala, which is highlighted there as well, under the up
Yeah.
next section.
Yeah. So I mean, these what you don't know, and then I'll say this tomorrow, but I mean, we knew back in a Quiznos in 2008 that we need to build a network to do this work together. We should not be doing this work apart. This CLEAN network is all about that. So this is why I've left this back in here, and then these are some of the assets that are available through the U.S. Global Change Research Program related to the teaching pages. So, you know, I think that's pretty much it. So I just want to thank you all. This doesn't work if you don't exist. Like, we do our part, and then we work in partnership across all these amazing organizations and institutions and individuals. So I'm speaking both to the people on the call today, but then also to all the people who will be listening. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask again, Frank, it's Cass Miller
Sure.
with Our Climate Our Future.
I'm now looking at you all.
Oh, okay, great.
I stopped sharing,
I
so
was like, look, I'm
I can
describing.
see you. Thanks, Cass.
So yeah. Hey, thanks so much. When you were discussing solutions in your listening sessions, I really want to kind of drive in and get an example of what that looked like, because that was really interesting to me.
Sure. So a couple things. One is in 2009, we talked about solutions in the adaptation principle, which was essential principle 7, and the mitigation principle in 2009, which was 6. And they're kind of solution oriented, right? But the new 8, hope and urgency, the concepts that are involved there, right? So looking at how essential principle 6, 7, and 8, the concepts that are under those principles are really important to look at if you're wanting to get into how we look at solutions, right? Because the other thing is, I think essential principle, I don't have the list in front of me right now. I don't have this memorized yet. It's so much has been going on. But the idea of, you know, we have to decarbonize a certain amount by a certain date in order to avoid dangerous climate change. We're already in climate change. We're trying to avoid the really dangerous stuff. That's really where the goal is right now, internationally and domestically. So, but looking at exactly how do you do that is in the concepts that are in the document. So I think, Cass, I would read it and see if the essential principle 5, 6, 7, and 8, because justice is also an important piece. Like, those are really going to get into where that solution architecture is going to be robustly named in specific details.
Thank you.
And if you are like, what? How did that not get here? I'd love to hear that, right? Because we got as much as we could. It's not perfect. There's been compromises, but I think that's an important thing to hear as we continue to do this work and then move around and improve it between now and the next time.
I appreciate that. It's a good guiding principle because we want to be able to support the educators who are really doing this work, and we want to be able to figure out exactly like how we can align here. So I appreciate that.
And I would just take it one step further, is like actually the young people. I mean, when you talk to young people who really are starting to clue in on what climate is, they're pretty upset with the education system. Like, I'm being kind, because I'm in a public recorded platform. They're mad as hell. And they really feel like education is not serving them. And they want it to serve them on things that they find important. So, like, we've given a guide to what does that look like from our perspective. I think it would be, but they really want more time. They want different time. And I ask, during this whole time, anytime I got in front of young people, middle schoolers, high schoolers, we had a lot of youth listening sessions. I'd ask them a question like, how do you want climate change taught? And they're like, you're asking me that question? I don't understand. That's like syntax error. We don't get to answer that question. I'm like, well, just answer it anyway. And they were like, well, oh, okay. So I can answer the question, what do I want to be taught? That's an interesting thing that we don't do. We should. And I said, well, give me the ratio, like problem solution. And they're like, oh, they almost always have an answer. And the answer is either 30% problem, they really want to understand the problem, 70% solution, or 80% solution, 20% problem. They want to understand the problem and really understand it properly. And that's where their science does a really great job. But they also want a whole lot more time on the solution. And I think we're trying to make that balancing act inside this guide in a much more explicit way to honor what their lived experiences in our vast forms of education. It's sometimes awesome, but often not. That's a long answer, Cass. So I'm
Thank
sorry.
you. No. I really appreciate it. I'm in.
Hey, Scott.
There's a question regarding, you alluded to this, about the barriers and bringing this document into the public sphere, or talking to different parties, teachers, educators. I mean, in particular, I wanted to sort of bring this into the discussion here with Cassandra and Carolyn about our
Yeah.
Florida people here. We have
Yep.
resistance at the top levels in the state with respect to the governor and state officials on climate literacy. So how do you think that would play out with distributing some of this information to people in Florida about this and getting them on board with the importance of this?
Sure. So I mean, Scott, I think one of the things we've heard for a really long time is that agencies like NOAA, NASA, EPA, all the cast of characters who were involved in this process, while some people have credibility issues with us, we in the education realm, we tend to have strong credibility, trust, reliability on topics like climate. And so, once you get past I understand the challenges you're facing in Florida, right, at the state level and how it interacts with communities. But to sometime, you know what? Science is science, and it's telling us some very clear things, and you can't mess with that. You can't just go, well, there's that science and then there's that science over there. No, that doesn't exist here. So it's unfortunate. It's counter to what some people are trying to do, but I think the standing of the document is worth something, and that the rigor and the excruciating rigor we used to get to this every word was carefully considered, and there's a lot of words in this thing. So that should be worth something to people who are serious about education. And it's unfortunate that it's hard because of the cultural context, but that's just the work. Some places it's easier, some places harder. But Scott, I hope that the back cover and the branding, and then it gives some cover for people who really want to do this work because they think it's the right thing. I've seen that often with people are like, it may not be the most educationally, pedagogically sound stuff, and the language is a little bit wonky because it's coming from the science group, but at least it's credible. I've heard people say that it is accessible, which makes me incredibly happy because it was hard to get that. But if it's accessible, credible, and relevant, and we've done all three of those together, I think it will help places where it's hard. And this is for all, not just domestically, it's for everyone on the planet. This was built in the spirit of all countries, as a good that we've done to move to inform. I just was training Forest Service diplomats because they do this work in helping that exchange internationally, not just here. So, I mean, that was the spirit and intent. We did this. So I think that, but if it counts, if it works, it'll help. If you just like dismiss it, like that's just propaganda, it's not. But you know, that's our process. That hopefully that's helpful. And I saw Caroline
Thank you.
and Yoka in Climate Week when we were releasing this. So you know, Caroline, she's always kicked me in the tush hard as ever, and I love her for it because she keeps me doing the good work. So say hi to her for me.
Will do.
Uh, oh yeah, there you are, Carol. Don, you have your hand, and then Sarah. I think we've only got about 6 minutes.
Yeah, I was just, you talked about the importance of talking to kids about the education they're getting. And I agree, that's hugely, hugely important, and was very effective in our lobbying visits for the New York State bill, which hasn't passed yet, but I think things are percolating along well. And I think the most effective thing we did was bring students with us to complain about essentially the absence of climate change education. You know, they're mostly not getting it. And my soundbite for pushing that those efforts is ask a young person in your life if they're getting the climate change education they want and deserve. And almost universally, you will hear, no, they are not. And it's up to us.
Yeah, it is absolutely up to us, and you know, it's appropriate, it's important, but the doing of it is actually where I think, you know, September 25th, we switched to building this literacy on our side, and I think this is the work before us, is how do we actually get that to happen for every learner, every student, everyone, so that they're not feeling blindsided and surprised and frustrated and you know, but that's you know, but the policy moves, like what's happening in New York, what's happening in Washington State, what's happening in Maine, what's happening in Illinois, what's happening, you know, in parts of Florida, is, you know, is really where that heavy lift is. But at least the stuff we've been doing hopefully helps that process, like the conversation we just had with Scott. So Sarah, it looks like you might be the last question.
I just want to give you an invitation to go back and talk about the link between the NAAA guidelines and this.
Sure. Yeah.
The complementarity of it, perhaps.
The braid. It's a braid,
Braid.
right? And I would put the three things that came out together. Is the transformational skills guide, which is a really interesting skills architecture. May not be the right one, but it's in process. The excellence in environmental education guidelines for educating for climate action and justice. Climate action and justice. Thank you. I almost got it right. And then the climate literacy guide. Those three things, when you weave them together, actually complement each other really strongly. So to be explicit, the case studies, which I think Bora calls them something else in the excellence guidelines, are actually fed into the case studies that are in the transformational skills guide.
Oh,
that are
wow.
at the end of the skills guide. Yeah.
That's
I mean,
great.
I was involved in all three of these.
I know.
And so we all knew that these were like, but we're still wrestling with the same work, right? climate science alone, education is not enough, right? So the movement into justice, the movement into action, the movement into skills, the movement, like we've been doing this work in places and parts of our community, but we kind of are trying to collate it into a new operating system that we've updated. And so now wrestling with it in your practice, whether it's in universities and colleges and technical schools, whatever it is, these 3 documents, I think, will happen. And so as we were writing the excellence guidelines, we're also over here writing the climate literacy guide, and we were building the skills architecture. Same people were involved in different parts. And so we were trying to kind of figure out who could author which part of the work. And I think that's those, but I would see them as 3 pieces of one whole. And there might be some other pieces that are out there that, I'm not aware of yet. But I think that having frameworks, and I guess the last thing I'll say here, because I do have a 2 o'clock, is when I was asked to create a climate literacy guide, I was leaving teaching and I was like, I want to do something important on climate and education. And so I came to NOAA and they said, write the climate literacy guide. I was like, is that important? Is that going to do anything? Does that actually change anything that's significant? And it turns out the answer is flipping yes. A document actually carries a lot of power. And I mean, I feel my 11th grade English teacher just yelling in my head now that many, many years ago, that would be 1983, right? When I was in her classroom, because words actually really matter. Which words you use, how you write them, who reads them, do you understand the context that they're being taken in? So I think those 3 documents really do set a new form of how we do this work that is really resonant with the work that we've learned by the doing of it. A lot of people here on this call, I know your work, but did we capture that work as well as we could in these 3 documents? I think we did a great job. Not perfect. There were compromises that had to be struck, but I think that I would look at them as a set of 3, a rope, that are woven, as opposed to one or the other or the other. They should be seen as a set. So unfortunately, I have to start the meeting that is 2 o'clock, so I have to leave here. But I deeply respect and honor you all, and to all of you who are here, and then all of you who are listening beyond now. Because again, this doesn't happen without all of you working with us in partnership. And so this is a part of what we're giving to the partnership. Hopefully that is taken and valued, and then we can do the work together. So thank you.
Permission to share these slides, a PDF version of these slides
Totally.
on the listserv? Okay, great. Perfect. Thank you.
Permission granted.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
If you could change the 8 to 9, the 9 to 8 on the date, that would be awesome.
Okay, good
Before
call.
we share it. I caught
Good
that. Anyway, see you all.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.